The instructors warned the cadets that the tundra moon could shift moods without warning, but no one expected the change to strike so violently. The day had been cold, but manageable, with a thin veil of frost covering the flat plains and the occasional shard of blue ice jutting from the ground like broken glass. The alien cadets moved across the training zone in bright groups, confident that their equipment would handle whatever the environment produced. Liam, the only human in this training cycle, walked apart from the others, keeping an eye on the horizon where the sun hovered low and sluggish, as if reluctant to drag itself across the sky. He knew from earlier briefings that the planet's shallow atmosphere allowed heat to bleed out the moment the light moved away, and he felt an uneasy pressure settle beneath his ribs. He had experienced temperature drops on Earth during winter expeditions, but nothing in his memory compared to the warnings provided during orientation. Even so, when the instructors released the group into the field and activated the survival timer, most cadets treated the mission as a routine endurance drill. The air felt stable enough. The wind cut, but not dangerously. Equipment indicators barely flickered. Everyone assumed the night would fall slowly. They were wrong. The first sign of trouble arrived as a subtle shift in the quality of light. Liam noticed it before the others because he had spent the afternoon studying the sky, mapping how fast the sun drifted and how sharply the shadows elongated. When the sunlight suddenly thinned, becoming pale and metallic, a pulse of instinct told him the real cold was coming. He looked across the plain and saw several alien cadets adjusting their gear, unaware that the shift in color meant the temperature was already plunging. Within minutes, the frost deepened into a crawling sheet of ice, spreading across the ground in intricate veins. Liam exhaled, and the vapor from his breath crystallized instantly, scattering like powdered glass. The chill hit him through the suit before he could fully brace for it. He tightened the straps around his forearms and neck, knowing that no standard-issue gear was designed for a 70-degree drop occurring in less than an hour. A sharp wind rolled across the plain, and the alien cadets finally realized something was wrong. One cadet, a tall insectoid girl named Ressa, raised her trembling hands in alarm as her outer panels began frosting over. Another cadet stumbled when his boots stiffened. Some tried to activate suit warmers, but the sudden temperature collapse overloaded their thermal regulators. Several panels flashed red, indicating critical strain. Liam moved immediately to reduce exposure, lowering himself behind a ridge of ice. The wind howled in long, hollow tones, carrying flakes of frozen dust sharp enough to scratch the visors. The sky darkened faster than any of the aliens could comprehend. It seemed impossible that afternoon light could collapse into night so quickly, but the tundra moon rotated faster during certain orbital cycles, creating violent thermal swings. Liam had listened carefully during the instructor's warnings. The others had not. Within moments, panic rippled across the training field. A cadet with wide, luminous eyes whimpered as her fingers stiffened inside her gloves. Another stumbled toward a shallow crater, trying to shield his chest unit, but the cold had already penetrated the seams of his suit. The wind dragged ice shards against his legs, and he shouted for assistance in a strained voice that barely carried through the storm. Liam scanned the landscape, counting the number of cadets still upright. He knew the temperature had not yet reached its lowest point. The drop had only begun. His own body reacted to the cold with familiar discipline. His muscles tightened, conserving heat, and his breathing became shallow but controlled. A deep memory stirred within him. Old Earth training sessions, where he learned to read cold not as an enemy, but as a pattern. Here, the pattern was brutal and accelerating. His visor flickered with temperature readings that descended faster than he had ever seen. 50 degrees had already slipped away, and the moon had not yet reached true night. He turned to the nearest cadets, raising his voice in an urgent command. He had no authority among the alien students, yet several looked at him, drawn by the steadiness in his tone. He motioned toward the ice ridge he was using for shelter. Some hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but the storm made the choice. A vicious gust slammed into them, knocking 2 cadets to their knees. Liam steadied one by gripping her shoulder and guiding her behind the ridge. The cold deepened into something heavy, almost sentient, as though the air itself wished to push the cadets into the ground. Frost consumed the surface of their suits, creeping like living vines. The ridge blocked the worst of the wind, but the temperature continued falling. Liam understood that they needed a plan quickly, or the cold would claim the weakest before the hour ended. He looked around at the alien cadets huddling against the ice, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. He could see fear in every face. It wasn't the fear of failure, but the fear of brutal, unavoidable cold that could extinguish consciousness without warning. For a moment the storm eased, allowing Liam to observe how the ice reacted around them. The frost patterns thickened in sweeping arcs, indicating the direction of the thermal currents. He recognized the signs. Once the sun fully disappeared, the final drop would hit fast. His instincts sharpened. While the aliens whimpered and clutched their malfunctioning suits, Liam focused on the environment and how it behaved. The tundra moon had a thin upper moss layer beneath the frost. He remembered the briefing. If the surface froze too quickly, the moss became trapped beneath an insulating shell of ice. If he could break into that layer, he might find something useful before the worst cold arrived. The thought lodged in his mind with growing urgency. He pressed his gloved hand into the ice beside him, testing how thick the layer felt. It cracked more easily than he expected. That meant the temperature drop had frozen it rapidly, preventing the deeper layers from stiffening completely. His pulse steadied. Even in this crisis, the environment gave him a chance. Around him, the alien cadets shivered, each breath rattling painfully in his or her chest. Liam tightened the seals on his glove and pushed his weight into the ice, cracking it more forcefully. The sound echoed sharply in the freezing air. Several cadets looked up, startled by the noise, but he barely noticed them. He continued breaking the surface layer, confirming that softer material existed underneath. Relief flickered through him, not comfort, but clarity. The storm had become predictable again. He understood the situation now. The temperature drop was catastrophic, but the moon's own biology offered tools to survive. If he could act quickly, he would keep the group alive long enough to see dawn. The storm intensified once more, as if offended by his confidence, but he no longer felt that creeping fear. He had a direction, and the night, no matter how cold, would not claim him or the cadets around him without a fight. Liam worked quickly once he confirmed the thin crust of ice could be broken, knowing the cold would soon reach a point where even trained movement would slow into dangerous clumsiness. He pushed himself upright, feeling the brittle stiffness creeping through his suit's joints, and glanced at the cluster of alien cadets pressed against the ridge. Their bodies continued trembling violently, and some struggled to keep their visors clear as frost crawled across the inner layers. The wind roared overhead in disorganized bursts, sweeping spirals of frozen dust through the air. Liam tightened his jaw, stepped out from behind the ridge, and moved into the bleak open plain without hesitation. The storm instantly wrapped around him, numbing his fingers even though the gloves were sealed tight. His first objective was simple: find anything organic that retained heat. The tundra moon was sparse, but definitely not dead, and somewhere beneath the layered frost existed the moss he remembered from the briefing. The problem lay in digging through the rigid surface without losing too much energy. The storm wasted no time punishing him for leaving his shelter. The wind hammered into his chest with enough force to stagger him sideways. He dug his boots into the ground, leaned his weight forward, and refused to let the cold dictate his pace. The cadets behind him watched his silhouette blur through the storm, some too weak to call out, some simply stunned that he willingly walked into the center of the freezing field. He dropped to one knee a short distance from the ridge and used both hands to chip away at the ice layer. The brittle crust shattered into translucent fragments, scattering across his visor before the wind carried them away. He dug faster, ignoring the pain that crept up his forearms. Beneath the first few centimeters, the ice darkened into a slightly softer shade. That meant the layer below still held moisture and organic remnants. He struck the surface again, cracking through it. The smell reached him immediately, a faint earthy scent rising from the exposed moss trapped under the frost. Relief washed through him, not because the cold lessened, but because he now knew the planet still offered tools even in this worst moment. The moss beneath the ice was thick, matted, and surprisingly springy despite the cold. He tore a chunk free, shaking away frozen particles. The texture clung to his gloves, and he felt how the fibers resisted compression. The moss trapped air extremely well, and air meant insulation. He filled one of the flexible side compartments of his suit with the moss, packing it down as best he could. Now he needed more. He moved several meters and broke another patch of ice. The storm clawed at him, scraping frost over his visor. He lifted an arm to clear it, forcing himself not to waste motion. Every minute outside the ridge meant more heat lost, more pressure on his suit's regulators, and less time to return before the cadets could slip into dangerous hypothermia. He expanded his search, walking in a diagonal pattern to cover more ground. His boots crunched loudly through the ice, each step carving small valleys in the frost. He dug again and again, collecting both moss and the fibrous vines growing beneath the surface. The vines were tougher than the moss, but more valuable. He tested a piece between his fingers, bending it gently. It resisted breaking even when cold, which meant he could weave it. The idea formed instantly: mats, wraps, barriers. He needed enough material for multiple cadets, not just himself. The storm dimmed the landscape, reducing visibility so severely that he could barely see more than a meter ahead. Still, he continued. The cold gnawed at his bones. He felt the numbness creeping into his fingertips despite the insulation of his gloves. His breath fogged the inside of his visor, creating a small halo with every exhale. He forced himself to stay focused, scanning the ground for darker patches of ice, which indicated trapped organic matter beneath. After several more minutes of digging, he had collected enough moss to fill both side compartments and enough vine strands to wrap around his forearm multiple times. The moment he paused to catch his breath, the storm punished him again. A massive gust slammed into him with such force that he dropped to his hands and knees. Ice shards stung the exposed sections of his suit. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, determined to return with the materials intact. When he turned toward the ridge, he saw vague figures huddled together, cadets struggling to remain upright. One slid partially onto her side, too weak to correct her posture. Liam felt urgency spike through him. He adjusted his balance and made his way toward them, leaning forward so the wind pushed him instead of knocking him off course. Each step felt like wading through a river of frozen sand. The cold had grown so intense that even the air seemed heavy around him. His lips tingled, and he felt the familiar warning of dropping core temperature. He pressed forward, barely noticing the storm's claws dragging across his body. As he approached the ridge, two cadets noticed him and tried to sit up straighter, their bodies quivering uncontrollably. One of them, a young reptilian boy with pinkish scales, attempted to speak, but only managed a cracked whisper. Liam raised a hand to silence him, not out of disrespect, but because he could see the strain in the boy's posture. The cold damaged him far faster than it damaged Liam. The other cadets watched the human emerge from the storm with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. He carried nothing more advanced than moss and vines, yet his calm steps suggested he believed these simple materials mattered. Some blinked slowly, barely holding on to consciousness as the storm battered the ridge once more. Liam dropped into a crouch beside the group, unpacked the moss from his compartments, and inspected the vines in his hands. He knew he had no time for explanations. His main priority was maintaining body heat. He needed to build something that trapped warm air and kept the cold from scraping directly against the suits. He checked the cadets' faces one by one. Some were dangerously pale, others unfocused, their pupils narrowing in a way that warned him of approaching hypothermia. He tightened his grip on the vines. The foraging was only the first step. Now he needed to engineer something fast before the remaining warmth inside their bodies slipped beyond recovery. The storm howled overhead, shaking the ridge with a low, rumbling growl. The temperature plummeted again, forcing the cadets to lean closer to the ice for support. Liam steadied his breath and shifted his weight so the wind couldn't knock him sideways. The moss rested at his feet, dense and heavy with moisture that had not yet fully frozen. The vines curled across his glove like fragile muscles waiting to be shaped. He had gathered what the environment allowed. Now the survival test entered its next stage, the stage where skill mattered more than equipment and instinct mattered more than instruction manuals. The cold pressed against him from every direction, daring him to fail. He leaned toward the nearest cadet and began preparing the first layer of insulation, knowing the storm would not wait, and the night would only grow more merciless. Liam knelt beside the trembling cadets and pulled the first handful of moss closer, feeling its damp resilience beneath his gloves. The cold made his fingers clumsy, but his mind stayed sharp. He had little time before the weakest of the group slipped into a state where no insulation could bring her back. He forced himself to breathe steadily, ignoring the sting crawling up his arms as he separated the vines into long strands. The fibers tangled together naturally, which gave him an advantage he had not expected. All he needed now was a structure, a frame strong enough to hold the moss against the suit without collapsing under the wind. He looped the first vine around his wrist, measuring its flexibility. It bent without snapping, and that small detail sparked a direction in his mind. He crossed one strand over another and twisted them into a crude grid. The cold made the vines stiff, but once he pressed them between his palms, they loosened enough to weave. He worked meticulously, tying small knots with the precision of someone who had practiced similar movements many times before. Each knot bit through the fibers and held them tight. Soon a thin mat began to form, rough but promising. He expanded its size by adding more vines along the edges, creating a small rectangle strong enough to support the moss. One of the cadets watched him with sluggish interest. She tried to lift her head, but the cold dragged her movements into a slow, trembling arc. Liam knew she did not understand what he was building, yet he saw a flicker of relief in her expression simply because he worked with purpose. Her visor had fogged at the edges, and frost traced delicate lines across her temples. He leaned closer and adjusted the thermal seal on her collar to reduce heat loss. She made a faint sound, a small exhale of gratitude or exhaustion, but her body language eased slightly. Liam pressed a thick layer of moss onto the woven mat. The moss clung to the grid, filling the spaces between the knots. He wrapped additional vine strands around the perimeter, tightening them to prevent the wind from ripping the moss free. When he lifted the finished piece, it felt surprisingly stable in his hands. The weight was minimal, but the density was exactly what he needed. He moved toward the reptilian boy he had noticed earlier. The boy's scales had dulled from their natural sheen. His breathing had grown shallow, and his posture curved inward as though he struggled to stay conscious. Liam wrapped the mat around the boy's torso, securing it with vine strands that he threaded under the arms and around the back. The boy's eyes widened in alarm at first, but Liam pressed a steady hand against his shoulder to reassure him. The warmth of human contact, even through gloves, seemed to anchor the boy for a brief moment. Once the mat was secured, Liam checked for air pockets. The moss trapped heat close to the suit, and the vines held the bundle firmly in place. The boy shivered violently at first, then gradually his trembling eased into something more controlled. Liam watched for any sign of improvement, and when the boy's eyes regained a hint of focus, he felt a small surge of confidence. The method worked. Encouraged, he turned to the others. The storm continued roaring above them, slamming gust after gust against the ridge. Snow crusted on the cadets' shoulders and helmets. He had to work faster. He retrieved more vines and began weaving a second mat, this time shaping it wider to cover the chest and upper arms of a larger cadet whose long limbs curled tightly as he fought to preserve the last of his warmth. Liam's hands shook from the cold, but he forced his fingers to obey. His gloves were stiff, and the wind rattled the fibers each time he lifted them. Even so, he refused to rush the knots. A poorly tied knot could unravel the entire mat during the next aggressive gust. As he worked, he noticed that the moss beneath the ice he had collected earlier retained more heat than he expected. The moisture inside it had not fully frozen because the deeper layers still held remnants of geothermal energy from the planet's crust. He pressed the moss together to tighten the insulation and shaped the second mat with deliberate pressure. When he placed it against the next cadet's suit, he adjusted the angle so the wind pushed the mat inward rather than pulling it away. He tied the straps high across the chest and under the arms, securing them tightly but leaving enough room for the cadet's limited breathing. The alien boy blinked slowly as the warmth gradually pooled around his torso. Liam crafted a third mat for the girl who had previously tried to speak. Her body drooped sideways, and he feared she would lose consciousness before he finished. He moved beside her quickly, checked the faint movement of her chest, and began wrapping her with the largest mat he could build on short notice. Her suit had developed frost cracks along the seam of her left sleeve, which meant the cold had penetrated dangerously close to her skin. He wrapped her upper body entirely, securing the moss so tightly that her arms could barely move. She exhaled a long, weak breath as the insulation began stabilizing her temperature. Liam placed his hand gently against her visor for a moment. Her eyes drifted toward him, unfocused, but alive. Now that the first few cadets had regained a fragment of stability, Liam stepped back to evaluate the rest of the group. Some remained curled into small shapes, barely reacting. Others struggled to sit upright. He moved from one to the next, distributing the remaining moss and vines, weaving smaller wraps for arms and legs. He reinforced cracked seams with strands twisted into cords, which he pressed into place like makeshift splints. His movements had grown faster but no less precise. Each mat he built improved upon the last, and soon he developed a rhythm: gather, weave, layer, secure. The ridge protected them from the worst of the wind, but frost built up constantly around the edges, threatening to bury the group in ice if the storm grew even stronger. Liam brushed away the accumulating snow with his arm and checked each cadet's posture. The subtle shift in their breathing patterns indicated improvement. Some no longer trembled violently. A few lifted their heads or shifted their legs slightly, tiny movements that proved the insulation held. The storm continued pressing against the world, heavy and relentless. The night deepened into a vast, icy silence, broken only by distant cracking sounds from the stabilizing ground. Despite this, Liam felt the first real sense of control since the temperature began falling. He had built something tangible, a barrier between the cadets and the cold. It would not last forever, but it would last long enough for him to take the next step. He tightened the last knot on the final mat, leaned back on his heels, and surveyed the group. Their eyes reflected the faint glow of their malfunctioning suit indicators, but behind that dim light, he saw resilience returning. He brushed frost from his own visor and lowered his head, gathering his breath before the next move. The storm would soon enter its coldest phase, and if he wanted the group to survive until dawn, he needed more than insulation. He needed shelter, structure, and a plan that could withstand the lowest temperatures this moon could produce. He rose slowly, muscles stiffening from the cold, and prepared to take the next step toward securing the group through the longest night of their lives. Liam rose from the snow-packed ground, feeling a sharp stiffness spread through his legs as the cold tried to anchor him in place. The insulating mats he had built held together against the wind, but he knew they would not be enough once the temperature hit its lowest point. He glanced at the horizon, where the last faint suggestion of light had already vanished behind the jagged cliffs. The darkness thickened into a physical presence that pressed against his visor like a living shadow. He had little time to act before the cold reached the level that could freeze exposed metal solid in minutes. He scanned the area around the ridge, searching for any depression deeper than the shallow shelter they already used. The storm smeared the landscape in rippling waves of frost, but he began spotting subtle changes in elevation. A few steps beyond the ridge, the ground dipped slightly, forming a natural hollow. It was small and half-filled with wind-driven snow, but it was deep enough for him to expand. If he could carve out a trench and reinforce it with ice walls, the group might endure the worst part of the storm without losing consciousness. He forced himself forward, each step crunching heavily as layers of frost thickened around his boots. The wind clawed at him again, trying to push him off balance, but he refused to slow down. He reached the hollow, dropped to one knee, and began clearing the snow with both hands. The frozen crystals stung his gloves, but the movement warmed his arms slightly. He carved deeper with deliberate force, breaking through the lighter layers first, then chipping at the harder ones beneath. The trench grew slowly, but it grew. He worked until he reached a depth tall enough for a cadet to curl into without taking the full impact of the wind. Next, he shaped the walls. The ice was brittle but stable if compressed tightly. He packed layers of snow against the sides, pressing them until they hardened into blocks. The storm accelerated the freezing process, turning the snow into dense walls within seconds. He repeated the process along the length of the trench, constructing a narrow but stable enclosure that would shield the cadets from the wind's direct force. A structure made from ice was the only thing the cold could not erode, and Liam relied on that brutal logic as he worked. His breath fogged heavily inside his visor, forcing him to swipe across it repeatedly. He felt his fingers beginning to numb again, but he pushed the sensation out of his mind. The trench was nearly complete, and now he had to help the cadets inside. He returned to the ridge, where the group sat huddled beneath the makeshift insulation. Their bodies still shivered, but the trembling had become more controlled. He touched the shoulder of the reptilian boy first. The boy lifted his gaze weakly, his eyes reflecting a dim spark of awareness. Liam motioned for him to rise and offered his arm for support. The boy leaned against him as he stood, his movements slow but no longer disoriented. Liam guided him toward the trench. The boy stumbled twice, but Liam held him steady. When they reached the hollow, Liam lowered him inside and positioned him against the smoothest section of the wall. The boy exhaled sharply, as though even this partial barrier from the wind felt like a blessing. Liam returned for the next cadet, lifting her by the arm as she tried to push herself upright. Her knees buckled at first, but he steadied her with firm, controlled pressure. One by one, he moved each cadet into the trench. Those who could still walk followed him weakly. Those who could not were carried or supported until they reached the shelter. The wind intensified again as he moved the last cadet into the trench, the storm howling through the ridge like a beast venting its rage. The walls of the trench held, redirecting the gusts overhead and reducing the direct impact by more than half. Liam dropped inside and positioned himself near the entrance. The cold inside the trench remained brutal, but it no longer tore at exposed edges of the suits. Frost still formed on the cadets' visors, but their breathing remained steady, slow, thin, but steady. He reached for the remaining moss and vines he had stored earlier and reinforced the mats that showed the most strain. He pressed more moss into gaps formed during movement and tightened vine straps where the wind had loosened them. He checked each cadet's face carefully. The girl who had nearly lost consciousness earlier now breathed more evenly, her chest rising in a stable rhythm. The reptilian boy's scales had regained a faint glimmer, a sign that his temperature had improved enough to resist the cold's immediate danger. Liam allowed himself a brief moment to rest his back against the ice wall. His muscles ached from the relentless work, and the cold gnawed at every joint in his body. He could feel his own temperature dropping slowly, but not enough to impair him yet. He knew how to control his breathing, how to pace his movements, how to monitor the warning signs before they became irreversible. He shut his eyes for several seconds, focusing on the slow expansion of his lungs. The trench vibrated faintly as the wind hammered the world outside, but the structure held firm. He opened his eyes again and checked the group one more time. Even with the insulation and the trench, the cold reached its peak soon after. The temperature dropped so sharply that the air seemed to crack with invisible pressure. The trench walls groaned under the strain, but Liam had packed them well enough to keep them intact. The cadets curled tightly into their positions, conserving heat, and he positioned himself where he could shield the entrance from the worst of the gusts. Frost crawled across his visor until he could barely see through it, and he wiped it with gloved fingers that no longer bent smoothly. The air inside the trench turned dense and brittle, as though every inhale sliced his throat with frost. Time stretched painfully. The storm had no rhythm, no mercy. Gusts slammed into the trench in deep, thunderous pulses. The cadets clung to consciousness through sheer instinct. Liam watched for signs of fading awareness, drooping heads, slow breaths, unfocused eyes. Each time he spotted one, he tapped the cadet's arm or shoulder, forcing a response. A small movement, a slow exhale, a blink. Anything that proved the cadet still fought against the cold. His presence kept them anchored. His voice, though low and strained, cut through the storm each time he spoke a quiet instruction or reassurance. At one point, he noticed the girl who had been wrapped in the largest mat starting to slump sideways. Her breathing thinned into barely perceptible motions. He crawled toward her, lifted her chin gently, and pressed a layer of moss closer to her chest to trap more warmth. Her eyelashes had frozen together, but when he tapped her shoulder sharply, she inhaled with effort and opened her eyes again. She remained awake. The cold had nearly taken her, but Liam steadied her breathing until it returned to a bearable rhythm. The trench became a cocoon of strained survival. Every minute felt like an hour. The worst of the night eventually reached a stillness so deep that the storm seemed to watch them rather than fight them. The wind continued screaming above, but inside the trench, something had shifted. The cadets breathed more evenly. Their bodies no longer trembled uncontrollably. Liam watched the pattern and recognized the moment when the cold stopped dropping and began holding steady. The lowest point had arrived. He leaned his head back, feeling exhaustion press against his bones. He had done everything he could. The insulation held. The trench held. The cadets held on. Now they only needed to survive until the slow, distant approach of dawn. The trench remained silent except for the dull rasp of controlled breathing and the muted hum of failing suit regulators. Liam kept himself awake by listening to each inhale around him, measuring the strength of the group through the rhythm spreading across the cramped space. The storm still howled above, but somewhere within the blur of wind and frost, he sensed a subtle shift, a thinning of pressure, a softening in the way the gusts slammed the walls. It was not warmth, but it was something close to mercy. He raised his head slightly, brushing off the frost that clung to his visor. For the first time since the storm reached its peak, he saw a faint shimmer along the top of the trench, a change in light so fragile it barely touched the ice. The worst had passed. The realization moved through him not as relief, but as renewed focus. Survival was no longer a matter of resisting the storm's force. Now it depended on keeping the cadets conscious long enough for the atmosphere to warm. He shifted toward the nearest cadet, the girl wrapped in the thickest insulation. Her eyes remained closed, but her breathing had steadied into a soft, rhythmic pattern. He nudged her shoulder, and she stirred slightly, enough to reassure him that she remained aware of his presence, even if she could not fully respond. He moved down the line, checking the reptilian boy next. The boy's scales glimmered faintly, reflecting the weak hint of light filtering down from above. His eyes opened a fraction when Liam touched his arm, and the boy exhaled heavily, the sound rough but determined. A low, creaking noise echoed through the trench as the temperature began ascending by degrees so small they barely registered. Ice shifted overhead, cracking under the change in pressure. The storm continued its final furious lashes, but its edge dulled with each passing minute. Liam forced himself upright, pressing his weight against the wall to keep his balance. His body ached as though the cold had scraped his bones raw from the inside. He shook his arms gently, coaxing movement back into his muscles, and began clearing a portion of the trench wall to create a small gap. He widened the opening carefully, carving away brittle ice while leaving the upper edges intact so the structure would not collapse. A faint beam of pale blue light trickled inside, illuminating the frost-covered floor. The light shimmered weakly at first, quivering under the pressure of the storm, but as Liam watched, it grew stronger. The sun was rising. Not fully, not warmly, but enough to thin the darkness that had consumed the world only hours earlier. He turned back to the cadets. Some had opened their eyes, drawn instinctively toward the returning light. Others remained curled into themselves, but their breathing no longer carried the fragile tremor of bodies on the edge of shutting down. He knelt beside the largest cadet, adjusted the moss insulation around his chest, and tapped him gently to prompt movement. The cadet responded with a heavy groan and slowly shifted into a more upright position. Liam moved to the next, repeating the process, encouraging each cadet to reconnect with the world outside the trench. The cold loosened its grip slowly, grudgingly. The air inside the trench warmed just enough to allow muscles to relax and thoughts to sharpen. Liam studied the ice walls above them, watching the storm's remnants break apart into spiraling streams that drifted across the sky. The transition from night to day on this uneasy moon was never smooth. Instead, it resembled a battle fought between the sun and the atmosphere, each claiming dominance in violent swings. But the sun had won this round, however narrowly. When he felt confident the walls could withstand the remaining wind, he turned toward the cadets. "We need to move," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. The cadets responded with small nods, each movement deliberate and sluggish, but none resisted. He climbed out of the trench first, gripping the edge until he pulled himself onto the hardened surface. The wind brushed against him, no longer sharp enough to rob him of breath. He extended his arm downward as each cadet approached, lifting them one by one from the trench with slow, coordinated effort. Once the group assembled at the top, they stood together in a loose cluster, leaning heavily against the ridge for stability. The light strengthened with every passing second. Frost glimmered across their suits like crystal armor, but the deadly rigidity had faded. The cold still clung to the air, yet no longer in a way that threatened to extinguish life. The cadets stared around them in stunned silence, as if awakening from a nightmare into a world they had forgotten could hold color. A distant rumble vibrated through the ground, followed by the mechanical hum of approaching craft. Liam turned toward the horizon and spotted two sleek instructor transports descending from the upper atmosphere. Their engines cut through the thinning storm like smooth blades, sending flurries of snow spinning into spirals around them. The cadets straightened instinctively, though their bodies protested the movement. The transports touched down with heavy thuds, and the hatch of the first craft opened. An instructor stepped out, her expression already tense as she surveyed the landscape. She took several steps forward, scanning the ridge for signs of casualties. Her gaze locked onto the cadets first, shivering, frost-covered, exhausted, yet upright. Then she spotted the moss mats strapped around their torsos, the vine ties wrapped around their arms, the trench carved into the ice behind them. Her eyes widened as she processed the scene. Liam stood nearest to her, steady despite his aching muscles. The instructor approached him slowly, as though unsure whether she was witnessing something remarkable or improbable. "You kept them alive," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and respect. Liam nodded once, not out of pride but simple acknowledgement. She looked beyond him at the trench again, studying the reinforced walls, the dense moss insulation, and the way the cadets leaned against one another for support. The storm had not spared its cruelty, yet the group had survived in conditions that should have overwhelmed them within minutes. Additional instructors exited the second transport, rushing to examine the cadets. Several paused mid-step when they saw the improvised insulation mats. One instructor knelt beside the reptilian boy, checking his vitals, then looked up at Liam with a stunned expression, as if silently asking how such simple materials could have achieved what advanced suit systems could not. Another instructor approached the girl who had nearly lost consciousness, adjusting her visor gently and murmuring encouragement. The cadets responded weakly but with clarity. They were alive, alert, and recovering. Liam felt the weight of the night settle heavily across his shoulders now that the danger had passed. The instructors moved quickly around him, guiding the cadets into the transport for medical evaluations. The warmth inside the cabin drifted outward in soft currents, brushing his face as he watched the others climb aboard. He waited until the last cadet stepped inside before following her. As he crossed the threshold, the warmth enveloped him completely. The tension in his chest loosened, and his fingers finally tingled with returning sensation. He lowered himself onto a bench inside the cabin and let out a long, slow breath. The instructors glanced at him periodically, their expressions filled with something that resembled gratitude mixed with awe. They spoke quietly among themselves, mentioning protocols, emergency reports, and unprecedented improvisation, but he heard none of it clearly. His focus drifted toward the cadets resting across from him. Some leaned against the walls, others closed their eyes, but each one had regained enough strength to remain upright. The transport lifted off, leaving the frozen landscape behind. As the engines hummed steadily and the interior lights warmed the air, Liam felt a profound stillness slip into his thoughts. He had not acted to prove anything. He had acted because survival demanded it. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, he sensed that something had changed, not only in the cadets' perception of him, but in the Academy's understanding of what human instinct could accomplish when stripped of equipment and exposed to nature's raw extremes. The instructor nearest to him placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice lowered to a tone meant only for him. "You saved them," she said. "All of them." He nodded again, not needing to answer out loud. The conclusion was already written across the faces of everyone around him. The storm had tested the limits of endurance, resourcefulness, and courage, and he had met that test not with advanced tools, but with instinct, improvisation, and the simple materials the planet provided. As the transport continued rising, sunlight finally broke through the last remnants of the storm. The beam crossed the cabin window, spreading warmth across the cadets and casting a soft glow over their frost-lined suits. In that moment, Liam allowed himself to close his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in acceptance. The night was over. The frozen moon receded behind him, and the storm that had threatened to swallow them all faded into memory. He had done what he set out to do, and everyone had lived to see the dawn.